Very dear students and my audience, this is part 6 of the poem Reflections by Rafat. The 5 parts have already been done. You can look for them on my YouTube channel. This part 6 is related to the permanence of man. We all know that man is mortal, but why does the poet use this thing as permanence of man? It is not about permanence of man, it is about nature of permanence of man. I mean, he wants to say the things which we do, as the plants do, as the other things do, the things remain as symbol of permanence, not the human being himself. So let us see what does the poet want to claim with respect to his reflections on writing of poetry. The poet says, it is time to examine the nature of permanence. A tree is permanent not in itself but in the multiples it lavishes on the autumn air. So the poet is trying to say that this poem, part 6 of this poem, Reflections, he is going to talk about the nature of permanence. According to him, first of all, he should take the example of the tree. The tree becomes permanent not in its physical terms, but in its things which it does with the air. For example, when it sheds the leaves in the air, when it sends its smell or scent in the air, or when it sends its fruit here and there flying sometime, at that time it becomes permanent. Because though the tree may not remain, but the activity, but the phenomenon, but the nature which it has helped to grow, that would definitely remain. And this is what he calls as the permanence, nature of permanence. So, in this way, if he says that man is permanent, he relates it, the permanence of man, with respect to the things, functions, performativity which is done by man. For example, the poet says, man by the same token is permanent. Instinct is permanent. Words have a permanence of the sorts. So, with respect to the trees permanent, as we suggested in the last lines, he says that man is also permanent. For example, the instincts of man, I mean, what not habits, what he does out of his instincts, out of his default nature, out of the very thing with which he is born, these are permanent things. And in that way, the words which he speaks also are the permanence. So, in this way, man's body may be mortal, but his instincts are permanent. The words which he speaks are also permanent. So, this is the way how Tawfiq Rafat puts the permanence of man. He further continues by saying, a twisting goal track in the hills, saturated with pine smell, is remembered, or a path through the rice field long ago. He gives two beautiful examples. One is the example of the goat track, that goat track which has been traveled frequently by the goat, and it's not straight, it is twisting. And it's present in the hills because of this. The twist is definitely to be present. Wherever the path is easier, the goats would go forward. And not only this path is there, but also this path is saturated with the pine smell because frequently the pine grows on the hilly areas, and in those hill tracks, the path must be littered with the smell, at least, if not the leaves and other things like that. Same is the case with another example. The poet says that not only the path among the mountains littered with pine smells will be remembered always, but also the path which is made by the people through the rice field will also be remembered forever and ever. So the remembrance, the memory, the kind of phenomenon, the scene of these two paths is permanent. The animals and the human beings would walk on these paths, would disappear when death makes them disappear. But the paths and the way they walked on it, the marks of their walking, that will stay permanently. This is the way how some of the things of human life, animal life remain permanent in this world. And the poet further explains this permanence in a different terminology. For example, he says, what chose these unconnected things, done with inconsiderable, buried under tons of recent pain, still awaiting a voice, and rent them from our guts with such puissance? According to the poet, these things exist here and there around us, and we sometimes notice them and sometimes we do not notice them. The job of the poet is to connect these things which are normally seeming to be unconnected and unimportant. And these things, however, are present in our memory around us and they need to get a voice from us. And the struggle of the poet is going on in order to give them voice. That is why he says that he has done so and made us familiarized with those things of the nature which possibly most of the time we ignore. As Wordsworth has said, that if you want to explore nature, there are tons of things to be explored which go unnoticed, and the poet is the only person who would look at them, cherish the joy about them, and later on put the same cherish to be shared with the reader. Same is the case with this poet. He says that he wants to highlight those permanent things of human life which go unnoticed, which remain unconnected, and which need the voice, and poet is the very person who is ready to give the voice. So, part 6 of the poem is the voice of these things which are permanent in nature, available all around us. He proves this by giving number of examples. And then the poet says that he has done this job with such great pain and such a hard work that definitely these things will be remembered forever and ever because he has used the words. And about the importance of the words, before closing part 6, the poet says that words bubble to the top as if they had waited for this. To consider permanence is to study the casual. The poet says that when he was trying to reflect on these things, for example, goat's path, the path between the rice, the things which the tree sends in the air, and many other things of human nature done by the human beings. He says when he wanted to give the voice to these things, the words automatically came up on the surface. These words came so casually, so quickly that it appeared as if these words were also waiting that they must come up. Because words also make these voices permanent. The words also give permanence to the human nature. So that is why the poet says that he has given the color, the clothing of the words to these passions, emotions, and reflections and phenomenon and scenes of nature, that words also have become permanent and they have also made these things permanent. So he says and closes the poem by saying, to consider permanence is to study the casual. He says, don't focus on one thing and try to discover the permanence in that. This should not be done. Instead, the poet says that if you want to know the permanence, it is spread around you. Just think casually about it and you will be able to find it. Don't attach it with anything significant. Just go through the path and phenomenon of nature. You will find permanence of nature or nature of permanence. So that is why the poet has reflected in this poem in these terminologies to show how beautifully the nature of permanence is spread all around human beings. The only need is that, as the poet suggests, that the human beings should look upon them casually and try to think what actions of theirs, of animals, of trees, plantation is making their life symbolically permanent on this path of the world. So thank you for watching. It has been very good experience with you. Hope to see you watching again part 7 of the poem next time.